My good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone watching the webinar. I'm so happy that you're here with us for this webinar on Azure SQL Database and helping SQL Server professionals to get started in the cloud, get the feet wet with the cloud subject. My name is Armando Lacerda. My credentials are right here. My title, context, credentials right there. So I would be very happy if you take the time to connect with me on LinkedIn. I love to get connected with new people, new professionals. I do share some technical tips from time to time. I kind of tweet from time to time too, but not as often. In any case, if you'd like to connect and ask me questions after this session, it will be great. I do have a profile on Facebook too, but that's more personal stuff. So if you want to me, riding my bike or riding surfing, you're gonna find me there. I'm a senior cloud data solution architect with Wintellect. I've been working with Wintellect for 2 years, and I've been working in the cloud space for 7 years with multiple roles. And I have been working with SQL Server itself for 23 probably since SQL Server 6.5. So been working with SQL for a long time. I've been working with other databases too before SQL, and sometimes in parallel in migration projects. And again, this is our session for today, right? Microsoft Azure SQL Server for SQL Server professionals. So there we go. A couple words about Wintellect. If my mouse here, my click works. Let's try it again. There we go. So we are a consulting company. If you're here, you have probably heard of us. We are a consult company and also a training company. We do offer live classes. When it's safe again, we're gonna have in person, and we have been doing online classes throughout the pandemic, of course. And we also have the on-demand training, right? Video recorded trainings, and you can browse our catalog through our website. We are Microsoft Gold partners. We have tons of Microsoft certifications. Also Microsoft MVP and a certified trainer. So I deliver some of these classes from time to time when my consulting gigs allow me to. And we also have a collection of MVPs. We have a lot of MVPs working in the company, which kind of attests for the quality of services we do. For those who don't know, the MVPs award is an award that Microsoft gives to IT professionals like you when you start sharing what you know with the community, and you get noticed and you get nominated, and then you get awarded. So it's an testament for your contributions and also for your technical skills. We here in Wintellect, we have a bunch of book authors. As you can see, we have a lot of people who have authored a lot of books. If you're a .NET developer, there's a good chance you have read one of these books. And that's what we do. We like to share. That's why we're running this webinar, because we want you to be well informed and kind of prepared to move into the cloud space. By the way, this particular webinar, it's a very intro level to the cloud subject, right? And specifically to the database in the database supported cloud, or database as a service in the web space, in the cloud space. So I hope you're going to enjoy this one. To kind of level up and having a starting point on what we're going to discuss in here, when you hear about databases in the cloud or data in the cloud, you rarely hear about a DBA or cloud DBA. So one of the things I've decided to do in this session, for instance, is calling this session, for cloud DBAs, because it seems like the word DBA is kind of or the acronym is kind of moving away a little bit. And what you hear the most is like data architects, right? Data designers, data architects. When I first heard these things, I kind of got a little confused, and then it clicked in my mind. Yeah, I know what they're talking about now. The big data approach, and the data lake and Hadoop and all of that. All this data lake approach, they have the disconnection between storage and compute. So the data engineer is that guy that works with data engines. which have disconnected storage space. So kind of made sense when I got that. So back to the DBA universe, like you, I'm been working with SQL Server on-premise, SQL Server companies data center since forever. And as a DBA, these are some of the tasks, I believe you would agree with me, these are some of the tasks we perform, right? We do performance tuning on both the server and the database, sometimes even in the queries when we are supporting development team. We do disaster recovery, we define restore points and how long it takes to get a database back in case of a disaster recovery. High availability is not there, but it's one of the things that's around that subject too. Monitoring concurrency, security, auditing, development support, all of those tasks in there. So we are familiar with this, right? You and me, we are familiar with this thing here. What happens when we move to the cloud? And one of the first things, or one of the first questions I want to address in here is, by the way, what is the cloud? Is there really this kind of thing? Of course there is a cloud there, but what actually is a cloud in an intangible way? And I don't know if you remember this movie, and when I talk about this thing, it's like over 20 years old, right? I think it came out in 2000 or 2001, The Matrix, the movie. If you are young enough, that you haven't seen this movie yet, I kind of highly recommend. It's kind of a trip. And there is this scene in the movie when this little boy here is talking to the hero of the movie, Neo, and it's bending that spoon. You see the Neo's reflection in the spoon. There's bending the spoon with his mining power, and he's talking to Neo like, you're not gonna bend this thing if you think that it exists. Just think that it doesn't exist, then you can control it. And I find it kind of a catch line to discuss cloud sometimes with people that are new to the cloud, because they have this idea, the cloud really doesn't exist. This thing about cloud is just a marketing name. The cloud, it really doesn't exist. It's just somebody else's computer running in another data center. And in a sense, that is really true, right? A cloud, Microsoft has dozens of data centers around the world, and they're super big. They have buildings and buildings. There are multiple layouts for them. You can go into YouTube. There are some interesting videos there to show you how these data centers are built and the generations of these data centers. They have some data centers today that they submerge the servers in seawater, so they can be both powered and cooled by the sea currents. It's kind of interesting, a bunch of designs in there. So in a sense, that statement is really true, right? There is no cloud. It's only someone else's computer running somebody else's data center. And if you go like that, you are actually, comparing cloud to what would be a colocation data center, for instance. I used to live in Florida, and down there in Florida, it's a very common thing, especially in South Florida, that you have colocation data centers. Hurricanes, flooding, and all of that. So there are these special buildings, and you just put your servers there. They're super secure, but the whole appliance is yours. The building is theirs, and they keep everything that's needed to keep the building running in case of a disaster, right? A hurricane, Cat 5, whatever. But the appliance is yours. So in a sense, that could be a cloud because on that definition. But a real cloud is really way more than that. And there is a definition, technical definition for the cloud. You may get this slide deck later. There is, I have placed some links here at the very end, at the very bottom of the slides right there. And you can click on those links to check them out later. So the NISIT, they have created this paper where they actually define if your service provider, if your vendor is actually a cloud provider. There are a lot of criteria and definitions in there, but the 5 main ones are those ones I put here on this slide for you. And these are the 5 main elements. If you're using a cloud provider that's that doesn't fit on these 5 elements, your cloud provider is really not a cloud provider. So the first thing right off the bat is it has to be on-demand, self-service, without human intervention. So if you have to pick up the phone to ask someone, can you plug another hard drive there for me because I need more space for my database? Or can you slot in a new server? I need to walk in to put a new server in or something like that. Walking is really hard. You should never be able to request that. So if you have to talk to someone to get things done in your cloud provider, I mentioned, refer to mundane things, things that are really common, routine things like create a new virtual machine, create a new database, create a new storage place, or things like that. Then it's not a cloud provider, right? You're not in a cloud. Another thing that a cloud provider must have is high bandwidth broadband network access from any place, so you can have high-speed connections. And of course, high speed depends on your demand, what you need. Sometimes you have too much data, like we had customers that they have to move like 100 terabytes of data. And with the technology we have today, it would take weeks to get that data moved across. So in those cases, of course, you want to do some other kind of carrier to get the data to the cloud. But for the majority of the things, you should have good enough or large enough bandwidth from your cloud provider. Another important thing about the cloud provider, in order to really put a stamp that are using the cloud, is it must be multi-tenant. Otherwise, it's just your company's network or your company cloud or private cloud running somewhere else, right? So it has to be multi-tenant. And that's a kind of a tension point when people move to the cloud. We got that all the time when we are helping customers to move to the cloud. There's always this suspicious about, my data is not on my server. So, what about data privacy? What about making sure that nobody else is gonna look into my data or be able to pull off a hard drive and get my data out of the data center and things like that. For better or worse, be multi-tenant is a requirement for a provider to be a cloud provider, and they must have all the security measures in place to prevent all of this that I have just mentioned. But the bottom line is it has to be a multi-tenant, and security must be in place for those things. There are multiple aspects in Azure that supports that data privacy in multi-tenant environment. Rapid elasticity is also something very important. Like if I need to add more memory, if I need to add more hard drive, more disk space on my database, I need to do that quickly. I don't have to wait for someone to ship stuff in. That has been the case for like 99% of the times. There are some edge cases, and especially last year when the pandemic started, and everybody got together to help out with computing power to get things going, to help people and manage the pandemic when it was first starting. Azure did feel that a little bit. Some things, sometimes you went there and tried to create a VM, you were not able to create a VM, but that was some edge cases. For the majority of the cases, for all cloud providers, you do have that super quickly, right? You just request and you have it in a couple minutes. And then a very important one, so the number 1 and number 5 are really one of the most important ones, which is you pay for what you use. So for instance, I do have a SQL database in the cloud right now. I'm going to use it during the demonstration, and I'm going to pay for that database by the minute. I'm paying for that database by the minute. Actually, I'm not paying. Microsoft is granting us, so they grant me some Azure credits per month to do this kind of demonstrations. The point is I'm consuming those credits, and they will be consumed by the minute, is as I use it. And some of the services can be by the second, and some of the services are not even time related, are resource related. So as I copy data forth and back, or as I process data through a period of time, depending on how many CPUs I have in there, I pay for what I use, right? It's not like I have to commit for a month or I have to commit for a year. There are contracts with cloud providers where if you do commit, you get discounts, right? You got price discounts. But that's an agreement, right? It doesn't have to be like that. A cloud provider must allow you to go to pay for what you use, right, without long-term commitment. So if your vendor fulfills this 5 minimum criteria specified by the NSIT, good, you are already in a cloud. Congratulations, right? Otherwise, you are just running somebody else's computer somewhere else in another data center.
Hey, Armando?
Yes?
Your video is lagging. Can you either do something to fix it? You're talking before your hands are moving.
Can I do something about it?
Yeah, like maybe take yourself off the picture.
Okay. All right. Thank you for letting me know that the video was not working well. All right. So yeah. So this slide here show I kind of put. You see, there was this Microsoft conference that just wrapped up today called Microsoft Ignite. They used to run it once a year, but during the pandemic, they're doing twice a year. It just happened last September and just happened again this week. It just closed early this morning. And back in 2019, Scott Guthrie, a Microsoft VP for Cloud and AI, he was showing up the Microsoft services that are available in a cloud for data processing. And this is a screenshot of that presentation. I have here the URL, and again, if you get this slide deck later, or if you just screenshot this one here, you can browse it later. I got this screenshot here. I mean, this clip here is about 2 minutes that shows how a DBA job is made way easier when you move to the cloud, because a lot of the DBA responsibilities we have seen on previous slides, like this one here. Let me go back this one. A lot of these elements in here, they are either they have been shrunk, or they moved away, right? They're not under our responsibility at all. And I do suggest you to take a look on this clip later that I published on my YouTube channel. You can take a look in there and watch this on your own. But the bottom line is backups are done for you. You don't have to worry about backup. That's a kind of a shocking thing for most DBAs when they move to the cloud. Yeah, I don't have to schedule backups if I'm using the cloud the right way. The cloud will do the backup for me and will keep the backup for 30 days. So I just have to worry if I need to retain those backups for longer than 30 days. Otherwise, I don't have to worry about backup. I could do point-in-time restore at any time from that backup that I did not schedule. It's done automatically. And in that, when we're talking about SQL, right? And that's across the board, by the way, not just in SQL. But there are other data engines too. And if you're a SQL DBA, you look at this and then you're like, Postgres, MySQL, and I'm to work with these things too. Well, when you move to the cloud, it's usually a heterogeneous environment, and more likely you will be required to take a look on those things. And I'm kind of going to mention that more in detail as we move along. Another thing to keep in mind, and kind of I have to take myself out of the video for something for some reason it's lagging, and so this spot on the right in there is where I should be. So everything is going to be kind of a shift to the left here a little. So sorry for that. Anyways, when you look into computing as a whole, right? They organized the computing aspects into into all of these layers here, right? And all of these layers here. So we get this stack with these layers. And in order to get computing going today, you need network, you need storage, you need compute, you need virtualization top of this physical compute resources. And then you have operating systems on top of this virtualized environments, all the drivers and everything you need to get your application going. You have your bits and installed to support your application, compiled files and things like that, whatever local data is necessary, and the application itself, right? If you're running on premise on your own data center, all of this is on a company's responsibility, right? The company has implemented and has to secure all of this at the same has to secure all of this, right? Get them to work, make sure they're up to date and all of that. The thing is, when you move to the cloud, moving to the cloud in a way just means that you are moving the responsibility or delegating the responsibility of some of these tiers to your cloud provider. So if you move to the cloud and your first approach is just like running your virtual machines in the cloud, it means that all the hardware that's necessary to run your VMs are supplied by the cloud provider. So this is under their responsibility. The OS itself and the operating system, running patches, keeping it up to date, can be kind of shared. That's why it's kind of a gradient in here. Can be kind of shared. The cloud provider can help you with that, or you can take full control. It's up to you. But on top of the OS, whatever runs a virtual machine is on you, right? That's all on you. You have to handle all of this by yourself. And when I say that you have to handle this by yourself, your company has to handle this all by itself. It means that you have people in here, right? So that incurs in cost. The implicit thing about this movement in here is when you move to the cloud and the cloud kind of time shares the physical resources, you supposedly would be your company would be paying less for these things, and because there is less TCO involved. And while in here, you need more internal personnel to do these things. As you move to the next tier, right, you are actually delegating to the company all the way up to the runtime. And this is usually the sweet spot, is where people want to be. It's called PaaS, or platform as a service. The first one, the IaaS, is infrastructure as a service, and it's usually the first place people land in the clouds. But you don't want to stay in here. Actually, if you got one of our emails about this webinar, you may have seen that a line that was in there saying that lift and shift is kind of an utopia, and that's the lift and shift, right? It's right here, infrastructure as a service. Some companies do have some edge cases where they cannot move to platform as a service. These are valid cases, that they do exist, but this should be edge cases, and specifically with Azure, or in particular to Azure. Most of your cases should live at this point here in platform as a service. And the next stack in here on software as a service is when you delegate the entire stack to your cloud provider. And if you use Office 365, for instance, that is the case right there. Office 365, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, you can use them from your browser. You know that, right? We have done that. You can edit a document. You can. I could be presenting my slide deck from from the web browser, and the actual PowerPoint software would be running from the cloud. So software as a service for Microsoft is actually Office 365. Azure, and where you're going to find SQL Server and SQL databases, most of the things there in Azure is platform as a service. It's not software as a service. There are a few services that are actually software as a service in Azure, but the majority of the things are either platform as a service or infrastructure as a service. And that's a very important concept you have to keep in mind. And in case you have any questions about these things, you can put your questions on the chat, on the question window on GoToWebinar, right? And I will take a look at the questions at the end of the session. All right, so to show that to you, let me run this demo here. Let me go ahead and switch to my web browser, which is this one here. Let me make sure you guys can see. Yeah, there it is. So there's something here on top of my web browser on my screen. Let me move things around just quick. There we go. All right, so in this example here, let's say, see, I'm on the Azure portal, and I'm here on the resource group I have created for this demonstration. I already have a database here that I go back to it later, a database and a server. So this is a SQL Server and a SQL database, an Azure SQL database. But let's say I want to have a new one to support an application and move it to the cloud, or something new that my company is coming up with. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to add a new resource. Again, not picking up the phone, not talking to anyone. I just need Azure working for me. So I'll go ahead and click in here, and I'm gonna say I need SQL, and this is Azure SQL. So I'm gonna go for that and say I wanna create an Azure SQL. And I just love this particular interface in here. And hold on, something is going on here. It seems you are not seeing what I'm seeing. It's pausing screen sharing. I'm getting a message here from GoToWebinar that's pausing the screen sharing. Let me try this again. All right, now it's refreshed. GoToWebinar is kind of running weird today. Anyways, so let me start from scratch on this one again. Let me click back in here. And there goes the message once again. One sec. What is going on? Something is off here with my GoToWebinar. It's pausing my screen sharing. Let's try this just one more time. Come on. There we go. Okay. All right, let's see if that works. Let's go back here. So I'm back in the resource group. And if I click here on add, okay, now it seems to be working. Perfect. So I go ahead and, like I said, I click here on SQL. I type in here in SQL, I see Azure SQL going on in here, and I'm gonna ask to create a new database. So this is the point that I was making before, right? You have three options. You have infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, or software as a service. SQL Server doesn't have an option as software as a service, but from this screen here, you do see three options, and two of them is platform as a service, and you can see them right in here. This one, the first one here on the left, SQL databases, is platform as a service, and usually is where you want to be, right? You're gonna have the best benefits from Azure, in terms of pricing and what you can do and the resources that are available when you go for this one here, right? So this is where you want to be. If you can make a choice, if you can define which database you're going to use, you want to live in here, right? This is platform as a service. And then when you click on this tile, you get some descriptions in here. And of course, to create that one, I can just get started from here. The other one, the SQL virtual machine, is on the far right, is when you do infrastructure as a service. And sometimes that's your first step into the cloud. So you have a VM running on premise, and that VM is running a few databases, and you want to move that VM with the server and the databases to the cloud. So this is where you go. You come in here, and you're going to choose which VM image you want to deploy. There are collection, very extensive collection of options in here in terms of which SQL Server version, edition, and operating system you want to use, right? You have SQL Server for both Windows and Linux going on here. If I keep browsing here, it's probably going to pop up at some point. I don't see any here. Oh, there you go. SUSE, there you go. SQL Server 2019 running on SUSE or running on Ubuntu. There are a collection of options in here. So when you go for one of this, the cool thing is a lot of settings that are specific to Azure in the cloud, for SQL Server in the clouds, I rather say, sorry, for SQL Server in the cloud, they will be already preset for you. So there will be like multiple disks to separate your logs from your data files, and separating your multiple data files. If you have a large deployment, you can also work on that one. And so this helps you to just get your database on another computer somewhere else up in the cloud. But again, this is maybe your stepping stone into the cloud, but that's usually not where you want to be, unless if you have one of those specific edge cases where it has to work in a VM. Otherwise, you want to stay here. And this guy here in the middle, the managed instance, as the position suggests, it is an option in between a SQL database and a virtual machine. So when you run in a virtual machine, you have full control, absolutely full control of your SQL instance and your SQL Server instance and the databases in there, like you would have on-premise. When you are in SQL database, you have very little control in terms of the server profile. You have full control of your database in terms of security and firewall and these things, but in terms of computing and disk space, you have very little control, and we're going to explore that later. This one here in the middle is exactly that. You have more control on the server configurations and some of the features that are available in the virtual machine, but you're still restricted in terms of disk space, for instance, and some very specific server configuration settings that may affect Microsoft managing the instance for you. Because the name is really what it means, right? The SQL Server Managed Instance is a particular VM working for you in the cloud, but you don't have to worry about patching that VM, both OS and SQL. It will be patched for you automatically by Microsoft. And all the disks on supporting that VM will also be managed by Microsoft. You don't have to worry about that. But the server configurations will be available for you. They're not related to these things I just mentioned. They will be available for you. And of course, you can have multiple database instances in there as well. While in the SQL database is a single database. Even if you do Elastic database, the single database is what the name means. It's just one database. You don't have multiple databases and be able to query each other like you would have on a regular instance. Yeah, so that's the demo, right? That's the demo, so you can kind of spot which options you have and how they work for you. Another thing to keep in mind is these icons. When you move to the cloud, a lot of things are described by the icons. So when you get architecture references, you're going to see these actual icons here on documentations given by the cloud designers and things like that. All right, so that's that. Let's go back here to the slide deck. And yes, it shows the slide deck for you. I don't know what was happening with GoToWebinar, was just giving me a hard time. All right, so as you can see, these points in here, they kind of, a lot of them, they go away, right? Like disaster recovery and restore points, if you're using platform as a service, it goes away or is very simplified, right? We could say. In a sense that, again, if I need to keep backups, I just define for how long, because backups are already scheduled for me and will be kept for me at least for 30 days by default. Anything beyond 30 days, I pay extra. And a lot of elements in there, they are automated for me, as you could see. Actually, let me go back there to the browser, to the portal. Let me do one here for you, just so if you have never seen this process before. So this is the resource group. Resource group is just a management unity. It does not affect how the database works whatsoever. So I'm gonna give here a database name like demo01. Oops, demo01, there we go. And it's gonna work on a server that I already have. So the server here is very interesting because the server here is just a connection point. It has some firewall settings associated to it, but it's just a connection point. It does, unlike SQL Server on-premise, it does not affect much how the database works. So actually it's free too. You don't pay for the server when you do PaaS, right? You do. Remember, I clicked on the PaaS offering, not the virtual machine offering. So on this one here, this particular service is free. What you pay for is the database. And down here on the computing capacity of the database, this is what you pay for, right? So this is associated to this database, which means there will be a 2 vCores at this moment associated to this database, and this database can store up to 32 gigabytes of data. And if that's not enough for me, I can go ahead and configure the database and go around with the options in here to get more elements, right? Like I need more space. 32 is kind of small. So as I grow this one here, you can see here on the right side that my price follows along as I change this. So if I need to store more data, I can go up to 1 terabyte. And the funny thing is, and I'm gonna go back to this point later, the funny thing is, what if my database is more than 1 terabyte? So there is kind of in some offerings, some of SQL Server PaaS offerings, there is this link in between the size and the computing power. So if your database is that big, you need more computing power. Microsoft assumes you need more computing power to deal with that. So as I move along here, 2, 4, there you go. See, I got here to 8 vCores, and now I can grow this database to up to 1.5 terabytes. And I can do this at any time, any point. I don't, it's not like a commit and I cannot change. I can go back here and change this at any time, any point, which is a pretty cool thing when you think about it, how easy it is to do that. For people coming from on-premise, for my DBA friends, that may feel a little weird because you don't do this using Management Studio, right? SSMS, that's not the tool you use. You use the portal for this thing here. It's a cloud feature, so there we go. All right, so let's say I go for this one here. This is how much I would be paying, and if I could click here, review and create, it would get created for me, right? So that's how easy to get a database created for you in the cloud. And like I said, I already have one here created for us, so we don't have to wait for that thing to get created. So it is already here in the webinar resource group. There we are. So here in the webinar, it's gonna show up here in a second that we have a server and the database. There we go. All right, back to the slide deck. There we are. So that's how things change when we move to the cloud. To give you more perspective, more in-depth into this particular point, follow me along here on this animation. So as a DBA, most of the times we are really focused on the database engine, the SQL Server itself, right? If you're Oracle DBA or some other data engine DBA, kind of goes along the same line. So I'm always working SQL Server. I'm adding data files to SQL Server. I'm tuning up memory for SQL Server. It's always around the database engine. And you know that on-premise, if I need to get things automated in SQL Server using SQL Server resources, I also need to work with the agents, right? SQL Server agents. So these are the two pieces of SQL Server that are most important for most DBAs in the majority of the installations down there. But as you can see here, and I put this SQL Server box in here, kind of referring to on-premise, because when you have your server, you go and buy a license, and then you get you used to get a physical box. Now you just download ISO files and install your things, right? Everything is downloadable. But that's the idea, right? What is inside the box? So when you get a SQL Server license, when you get one of these boxes, you don't get just this two piece of software in here, these two binaries, these two pieces of software, but you get a lot of more services around it. And some companies, they do benefit from these other services, like analysis services, very popular. We see a lot of companies using it. And if you use Power BI, you kind of use it too. But there is a lot of other things in there. SQL Server does have artificial intelligence capabilities, and it's able to run like a Python and Python libraries on top of the data that SQL Server manages, or R scripts as well through the R services. There are things in here some people never heard about, like Polybase. I have seen Polybase on the screen, I've seen it working. There are some legacy stuff like data quality service that I used to use a lot. Now with artificial intelligence, it's kind of replacing that. Reporting service is very popular too. Analysis service, Power Pivot is used to be a thing with SharePoint on premises. Now it's kind of a gun. So we have all of these services, all of these softwares going around with SQL Server when you buy a license, when your company buys a license. But again, the focus one is this too. Now, when you move to the cloud, guess what? Microsoft gets this hammer, smashes, it smashes the box, and it starts licensing you in terms of subscription, monthly subscription, not for the entire set like you used to be on premise, but for each piece of software that was in that box. That's the smashing thing, right? Let's get these pieces, are gonna get them running in the cloud for you piece by piece. So if you need database, the database engine, for instance, you have that just as it just demonstrated for you, right? This last demo was just about this. I get SQL Server database engine running for me like that. But I don't get analysis service, for instance. If I need to have a SQL Server analysis service running for me in the cloud, that is another service that I have to instantiate by itself. I have to get it going in the cloud by itself, and it will be an extra bill. I will pay some extra for that one. And you know, if I go back here to the browser, you see, you know, I'm back here in the resource group. And if I go ahead and say, you know what, forget about the SQL, I already have one, I don't need to add another one. Let me go and add a analysis service. There it is, analysis service. So see, it's a different service, again, a different icon. And if I go ahead and click creating here, it's a different setting environment. As you can see, it doesn't even require a SQL Server. It runs kind of isolated on its own, and that's it, right? That's all that I need. When I get in here, I have to pick up a pricing tier. What is going to be the power processing capability power of this SQL Server? So I get a price tier and analysis service, already say, and off it goes, right? Off it gets running. So this is one thing that DBAs, when they move to the cloud, they have to adapt, right? You have to think of the database of SQL Server services pieces by themselves. And notice that in this slide here, kind of try to highlight for you that some of these pieces, they're just not there. Like in analysis service, you have analysis services there in tabular mode. If you're using multidimensional, you do not have it. Like if you use a cube, right? You do not have it as platform as a service. You can definitely have it as infrastructure as a service. Have a VM and install it there, right? But that's usually when you pay more. When you run it from a VM, usually you pay more. Every case is a case. You got to check that out and evaluate by itself. But as a rule of thumb, it always it's more expensive to run a service from a VM than platform as a service. But if you need this one here that used to be in a box with SQL Server, you're not gonna have it. And that is shocking. This last one here is shocking for most DBAs moving to the cloud. So, you know, all my alerts, all my jobs, scheduled jobs, all, you know, the operators that make gonna create in the server agent, SQL Server agent, yep, they don't move to the cloud, right? If you're going platform as a service, you have to re-implement those things using other resources in the cloud. You can do those tasks. You can definitely do those tasks, but SQL Server Agent is not a cloud service. You're gonna find the other elements to do this, you know, to translate what you have. And that's when people get a little discouraged because, you know, my thing is stable working on my VM. Do I have to give that up and re-implement that thing somewhere in some other platform? The answer is yes, if you do platform as a service. And if you don't want to do that, you can, of course, go VM, but then, you know, it goes into the budget aspect again. So if I go back to my browser, if I go back in here for my demo database, if I browse down here, you can see that I have some monitoring elements down here. This is not SQL Server Agent. It does not do everything that agent does, but I can set up some alerts based on some metrics. And if I go in here and start creating new rules and defining alerts on top of those actions on top of those alerts, I can, you know, email people if my SQL gets too busy and things like that. If I want to run things in a timely fashion, like automating stuff, right? You're not gonna find this in here. You're gonna use some other resource in the cloud that can run things based on events, triggering by events, like that clock events or an email that's being sent to that particular service. And you can usually do runbooks. You can do Azure Functions. You can do event grids. There are a bunch of options in there. Bottom line is, back to the slide deck, bottom line is agent is not there, and you're going to have to translate whatever you have in agent to some other cloud-born services if you want to go really into the cloud. On this demo here, this next demo, one of the things I want to show you, and let me get Management Studio this time around. One of the things I want to show you here in Management Studio is the fact that, like I mentioned before, a lot of things you are allowed to manage when you are on premise. So this particular SQL Server here, right, this local IP address is my local SQL Server running on my laptop. So I got some databases. Yeah, I got some databases going on, one database going on in here. But notice that I have Polybase running here. I have server objects I can deal with in here. And if I go into the database properties, I will be able to see the infrastructure elements for this database, as you are familiar with, right? You know what I'm talking about. And yeah, so we know when you get there what shows up. It's not showing on GoToWebinar for some reason, and whatever. Let's move on. You know what I'm talking about. When we go here, and this is in the clouds, that database I have shown you before. When you go in here, notice that I don't have the same structure. And when I go here into the database, I can see there is a demo database in there. And if I go and ask for properties, I would not see the data files that are in there. The properties in here are just for backward compatibility, like which query processor you want to use for SQL Server 2019, 17, or those versions that are in there. And that's pretty much about it. You don't have much properties to deal with. So notice that when you go to the cloud, a lot of management things you used to have, you don't have to worry about anymore, right? It's all done by Microsoft. So that potentially, that's the idea. Potentially, it should cost less for your company to keep this up, and your company wouldn't have to manage much of the things. So therefore, it should also release or relieve some of your stress in the staff, and that you could take care of business activities instead of technical activities, right? That is the main idea. Going to a close, right? To start wrapping up this thinking here. One extra thing you have to keep in mind when you go to the cloud is, as a DBA, as a SQL DBA, more likely you're gonna face scenarios when you move systems to the cloud, or especially when I create a new approach to your systems in the cloud, you're going to face scenarios where you're going to use this approach here called the polyglot database. So the polyglot database is it's more of a technique. It's not a technology. It's more of a technique. When you use the right database engine or the right storage place to the type of data you want to deal with. So when you go on premises, like your application is a SQL Server application, or your application is a Postgres application, or your application is a data warehouse application. But when you go to the cloud, it's very common. Like, I can have my tabular data in SQL, and I can have my images outside SQL in a lake or external storage. And I just have, like used to do on premise, when you save images on a hard drive, you just have the link, the address for that thing in the storage. Or I may have my SQL database getting data migrated into the Synapse for data warehousing, big data processing, if that's the case. The bottom line here is, more likely you will be requested to be a specialist, not only in SQL, but in a collection of other possible data engines. And this one here is even interesting, which is the stretched database in SQL Server. When you have SQL Server running on premise, you keep some of your data on premise, and you can split your database to have a portion of your data, usually the majority of your data, up in the cloud. Especially when you have large archive, you have to keep 10, 15 years of data, you have to be ready in the tables when needed, but you don't want to keep those thinking promise, you want to save money on that one. So there are a lot of things, right? There are your horizon is going to expand a lot with other database engines in there. So the bottom line is, when you start moving to the cloud, when you go to your vNext step in your DBA career, this is where you want to be, right? This is your happy place right here, right? You want to make sure that your projects are kind of aiming to get your service, your cloud support into the platform as a service, especially if you're doing Azure, right? It may not be the same thing when you go Google Clouds or AWS, for instance, but in Azure, this is usually where you want to be. You're not going to choose this option only if there is a thing in your database that's not supported in here. For instance, if you have a database that uses CLR objects like .NET store procedures, CLR store procedures, or functions, for instance, when you do these things, these are not supported in platform as a service. It's only supported in infrastructure as a service and also managed instance. So that's when you have to move because you have a technical constraint for that thing, right? And otherwise, this is where you want to be, right? This is your happy place. In order to get there, there are some steps you can follow, right? You see, put another PDF in here. This PDF here is the migration readiness white paper from Microsoft. You can download this PDF later. This picture comes from there. But the idea is, if you're running from your data center up to the cloud, perhaps your first step, like I said, is to rehost your VMs. You just move your VMs as is from on-premise to the cloud, and that's called lift and shift. Is that utopia? Like, I just moved to the cloud, I'm happy. It's usually not the case, right? You get into the cloud by rehosting, by doing the lift and shift, but you usually don't want to stay there. You want to move along in your cloud migration strategy by refactoring your computing elements. Like, if I have an application, can I get that? It's a web application. Can I get that web application refactor into microservices, or get them working on a platform as a service instead of IaaS on a VM, for instance? If I have business APIs that are running on bits through distributed COM, for instance, DCOM, can I re-roast those things through API management and things like that? So then you start refactoring, without moving or changing much source codes, but start leveraging elements of platform as a service. This step from here into re-architect is the most interesting one. Is exactly when you start rewriting code specifically for services. So this is the migration path, right? Where when you get to re-architect, when you get your service that was running like on MongoDB on a VM, for instance, into a SQL PaaS or into Cosmos DB, perhaps better, right, for Mongo comparison, then is where you're really in the happy place, right? Because you were able to move from infrastructure completely to platform as a service. And this one here, the rebuilds or rewrites is for cloud-born applications, right? It was completely written with the cloud aspects in mind. So there are pieces of code there for network resilience, for instance, because network fails from time to time. So your code is aware of this, and you're using the right service with the right code approach in order to avoid glitches in your application. Again, you are going to deal with polyglot databases, so you have to understand which particular database service in the cloud is appropriated for whatever type of data you are processing. NoSQL, relational, parallel processing with Azure SQL, with Synapse, or Hadoop, and backed by the data lake and so on. So getting to know which particular engine to mingle together on a particular solution makes your polyglot database design. For all of these things, you have to think about partition keys, segmentation of the data within your database. Because remember, if you're doing platform as a service, you're not in charge of disks. So you cannot do disk distribution. You cannot create parallel disk IOs like you would do on premise. If you are in the cloud, you do have to do this based on the bandwidth that's provided by your service level, which is a very important thing. So you have to design your data models and the elements in the data models to work within the limits, the boundaries of the service you want to work on. Your constraint is usually the budgets you have available in there. Yeah, so all of these things changed for exactly for that, right? For some of rules go away, some of the job responsibilities go away, and your vNext is more targeted into these 4 elements in here. First one, performance, focus on query tuning, not on infrastructure improvements, because you don't have access to the infrastructure elements to improve them when you do platform as a service. As a matter of fact, if I go back here to my browser just quick, and let me see. Yeah, if I go back here to my browser just quick, like what if I need to add memory to my server, right? This is my SQL Server database in here. And what if I need to add memory to this database? I have no option here. If I go to configure, I have no option in here to add more memory. And what if I try to create an index and the index blow up my temp DB? How can I increase my temp DB for this database? And yes, temp DB is per database now. It's not for the server anymore. I'm not going to find in a server. So how do I do that? This is all tied up to the service level I come to sign up for, right? So if I need to increase these things, you're going to see here on page documentation like this one here called resource limits, that when you sign up for like that one I was on, C serverless compute Gen 5, you're going to see that if I do vCores, oh, this is serverless. So let me see here, dedicated Gen 5. Let's go here just quick. Still serverless. Gen 5 part 2. Yeah, so if I go here, you see into vCores on this range, this is the amount of memory that will be added as I add vCores. And the same thing goes along with the other elements of the database. You see, the other elements in here, they are they increase as I add vCores to the elements. So the infrastructure elements, you're not really in control, right? It's based on the computing capacity you go in for SQL. That's a very important thing you have to keep in mind when you are migrating to the cloud, when you work with the cloud elements. All right, back to the slide deck to wrap it up. Move on. One last thing, and we are on time, right? We are right at the top of the hour, so I'm not gonna extend this for too much, but I left this for last because that's a very sensitive thinking here. Budgeting is one of the skills you have to grow in your daily activities, right? You have to work this particular skill here on as you go into the cloud for one main reason. And I got this slide here, I mean this picture here from the web. I found it really cool. When you go on premise, almost all your costs are upfront. So, you put a lot of money in hardware and infrastructure, and from time to time you buy software license. And we know software licenses are expensive, but in comparison, this, is a statistic that, again, like I said, I got it from the web. It comprises like about 99%, less than 10% of the entire cost of a on-premise data center. But when you go cloud, when you do cloud computing, most of your expenditures are based on the price of the services you sign up for. And this one here, you pay it once and done, right? You're gonna pay for a software license again when you do an upgrade. But this expenditure down here in the cloud computing, they're monthly expenses, right? You're gonna pay for this thing here every month. So adding up resources can scare your CTO, right? Because that's gonna get your bill really high. So being able to budget your solution in the cloud is the most, in my sense, is the most important skill you have to develop. Because if you design a great solution and put 80 vCores there to support application, great, but what's the price of that over time? Because you're keeping adding new expenditures in there. Keep in mind that the space shuttle program, this is kind of a corny, sorry about that, it's kind of a commonplace, but keep in mind that when science was trying to get to the clouds and to space, they had the space shuttle, what's a pretty cool program back then. Reuse these things. You can go to the cloud multiple times, go to the space multiple times, and do, try to get to other planets and all of that. But they had to shut it down, not just because of the accidents that happened, but on this interview for Forbes, this NASA employee, one of the managers in there, the name's there on the article, he specifically points out that the space program, NASA stopped going to the space, and that's the main purpose of NASA, right? To analyze space, to go into space. They stopped going there because it was getting too expensive. So if budget is out of control, your efforts, no matter how nice and shiny the cloud looks like, your efforts can come to a halt. And I have seen that happen in some companies. Budgeting went out of control. They don't know, they were unable to predict how much it will be, the next cloud bill will be, and they stopped the whole thing, right? Then no, let's move back into our on-premise data center. So being able to predict budget is very important. All right, so that wraps it up for us. This last slide here is just a tip. Like I said, I'm a Microsoft certified trainer. I deliver classes for Microsoft partners. I used to be more often, now I'm more into consulting, but I got this particular picture here from that migration readiness white paper that I mentioned earlier. And if you want to dive into these topics more, you should look into these Microsoft official classes. You see there are 2 specific ones for SQL Server to migrate the data from the on-premise to the cloud, one for SQL and one for open source NoSQL databases in the cloud. And there is one also for regular VMs if you are starting with infrastructure as a service. The basic ones, they're kind of short, 1 or 2 days. The ones that go more in depth into management of Azure resources, they are kind of a week long. So just a tip for you if you want to dive more into this. So with that in mind, let me see here. Oh, there was one message in the chat here about the screen that was not working well. And there was one message from Gopal here about the screen freezing. Sorry about that. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and type your questions in the question window. I'm gonna hang out here for a little longer. If you have to go, thank you very much for being here in the webinar. Sorry for the technical difficulties on the streaming side of it, but I hope the demos and the slides have helped you grasp a little bit about what is involved to move to the cloud. Let's see here if I get any questions popping up. Yeah, you can see the question here is kind of a quiet. One question just popped up in here. Let me undock this thing to read it better. All right, got a couple more questions in here. So this is one, lost audio, no, but that was not the thing. There is one here from Mossen. Does multi-tenancy condition exclude private cloud from this topic? Yeah, private cloud is not a public cloud, so definitely it does, especially because your private cloud is probably using VMs, and VMs is regular SQL management. Like I said, in Azure, usually we try to focus and get our services running on platform as a service, and that's not a thing you have on private clouds. So the answer is yes, it does exclude. All right, what else? Again, screen freezing, sorry about that. Are you going to share us the recording? Yes, this recording will be available. We're probably gonna get to edit a little bit to remove the technical difficulties there, but it will be there. And that was from Masai. Thank you, Masai, for your question. Let me expand this a little bit more. Srinivas, thank you. Thank you for coming to the session. I hope you have benefit from it. And again from Srinivas, if we have database procedures and triggers, how do we migrate to the cloud? So there are services. It's a great question. Thanks for the question. So there are services. Let me get the browser back up in here. If I go to the portal, there is a service in the cloud called SQL Database Migration. So if I go in here and do SQL migration, or just migration, not showing, funny. Azure migration, Azure Migration Management. So there are services in there. Actually, this is from a third party. See this logo in here? It tells you that's a third party. But there is an Azure migration service you can leverage, both for VMs and also just for SQL. So there is a data migration. I forgot the name they put in there. SQL migration. I've tried that before, right? Yeah, it didn't show. I found that out. But there is a service in here you can use to migrate your databases and have them syncing up cloud and on-premise for a while. You usually don't want to keep that for too long. And the other thing you can also use, if a database is that small, you can go into Management Studio, like I'm here right now. And this is my on-premise database right here. You can go ahead and right-click. If the database is not that big, it's like you feel like you can push it once and there is no incompatibility in the database. You have one of the tasks in here, which is get this thing up into the cloud. So there is an option here where you can push it. Let's see if I can find it here. Stretch, nope. Backup, restore, mirror, ship transaction logs, database upgrade. No, it's not showing the menu. Oh, there we go. Deploy database on Microsoft SQL, Azure SQL database. This is it. So with this option here, you can click on this guy. For some reason, GoToWebinar is not showing the wizard that showed up in here in my screen just now. Perhaps if I do this, oh, there we go. Now you can see. So this is the wizard that pops up, and you can use this wizard here, and this wizard will get your database, including your store procedure and triggers, if they are not CLR store procedures or CLR functions, right? So it does run a database compatibility check, and if it finds something that's not compatible with Azure SQL DB, it will tell you and will stop the process. But you can kind of try to get started from here. All right, well, let me see another question in here. Do we get the slides? Probably, I would say. I already shipped the slides to the training coordinator, to Rachel. I'm not sure if it's going to be made available online, but if not, just contact me. I can get you a link. Another one, from Chris. if loss of connection a problem if your apps don't have built-in retries? Yes, it is, of course. And Azure SQL Data Client has some retry options for that. You know, the actual SQL client. There are some intelligence going on in there, but your application should also manage that, right? So, and that's one of the things about applications that are born in the cloud. One of the aspects, the nature of cloud-born applications is they rely on network for everything, and the network may fail. We know IP packages are dropped here and there all the time, so you do have to have that logic implemented on your cloud-born applications. Another one from Chris. What has the experience been as to how often a connection to a database? It's spotty. It's usually stable, but it may happen, right, when a connection to the database drops. So it's kind of, it all depends on the day. Some days are good. Some days you have a cold snap or a hurricane come by. So, and again, the network connection has two ends, right? So if your application is running on a mobile device, for instance, you get all the things in between. One last one here from Chris. How do you measure performance of queries using Azure SQL Database? In Azure SQL Database, you have the same parameters, right? So your queries, they will require CPU, so you measure by CPU statistics, and they will require IO, so you measure by IO statistics. So what you gotta do is using the same techniques you do on-prem, but the way to fix performance is more into rewrite the query, so use less resources, then try to make more resources available, in a sense that, oh, I'm gonna pump up my vCores so my query runs faster. That's usually not the case, right? You see your query running faster when you go from 2 vCores to 10 vCores, but if you jump from 10 vCores to 20 vCores, your query will run exactly the same speed. What's gonna change is you're gonna have more bandwidth to support more simultaneous connections and simultaneous querying to the database. But once you get the query running to a speed, it will not run faster if you add more vCores. What you really have to work on is rewriting the query and creating indexes or some other objects, so the query uses less CPU and less IO. SQL Server Profiler, Chris, does work on Azure SQL DB as well. But keep in mind that SQL Server Profiler has been deprecated for about 10 years. So Microsoft still ships it with SSMS, it still ships it, it's still a supported tool, but it's a predicated tool. It's not, they're not going to invest much into SQL Profiler anymore. The best way to deal with troubleshooting, and you need to collect information from your queries when your queries go online, and when you are working on your queries in Azure SQL Database, goes into two elements on a database. So let me expand it here just quick so you can see. One element is the query store. So you can keep track of your queries as they come through, and you can see how your database is behaving for a query. So query store is your friend for that. And the other one is the extended events. So instead of using SQL Profiler, I would highly recommend you to use extended events. And for specifically queries troubleshooting, query store is also your friend right there. Okay. Profiler does not work well. Let's see. Like I said, I don't use SQL Profiler much anymore because extended events is you might be right. SQL Profiler, I think SQL Profiler does not work on Azure SQL DB. Let's take a look. So I'm going to share. You can see my screen probably. No, not yet. I mean my SQL Profiler. So let me get it to the right screen. Here's my SQL profiler. Now you can see it. So let's go ahead and try that out. New trace. And I'm not going on premise. I am going to the cloud. So let me get here the connection string from my SQL DB. Give me 1 second to pick that up. So this is the URL for my server right there. Control V. And SQL Server authentication and the password from STOTM. As you can see, I'm kind of into movies, right? Type this again. You must be a member of sysadmin fixed server rule of the auto trace permission. So you must be a member of SQL Server sysadmin fixed rule. Yeah, I do remember reading something about profiler not working in there. So I'm gonna put that on my notes in here and go into my LinkedIn to go deeper on that one later, Chris. But again, the best approach and the recommended approach is not to use profiler anymore, is to use extended events, right? So instead of using SQL profiler, please go for extended events. That's what I use all the time. All right. And I see no more questions in the question chat here. So with that, I think we're gonna wrap this up. Thank you very much again for attending this webinar. Again, my connection information there on the social medias, right? LinkedIn, Twitter. Please go ahead, connect with me. And Chris, if you can connect with me there, you can remind me of the question and we'll get an answer in there, okay? All right, guys, enjoy the rest of your day. Stay safe, and thank you very much.